said he's busy, he doesn't know if he'll be able to get in.
All right, fair enough. Ron, how are you?
Good, Rabbi. I wasn't, had a little bit of a scratchy throat this morning, and she who must be obeyed said I should not go.
Yes, that is the proper reaction. We are glad that you live in a matriarchy. Left to your own devices, only bad things could happen, I'm sure. All right, we are picking up what, 47B?
47.
Yeah.
Okay, so 47A goes down the road. And Ron, you have your own papers that you did?
Yeah, what I do is I open up I put the zoom to half of the field, and then I open up online the other one, and it's easier to follow because I could see.
Okay. So I see Herb, so I think I'm going to have to put it up on the screen for Herb.
Yeah, but I don't need it. As soon as I could set it up. Exit full screen. Where is it?
Okay, I'm going to share screen.
Oh, here it is. Da, da, da.
We'll see if Herb joins us or not.
40.
See what the running.
So it's connecting to audio.
Yeah, we see that. And someone's coming in with an iPhone and all of that.
Actually, the battery in my fob is going. So I figure I'm nearly a mile from here. If it's car doesn't work on the way home, I'll just leave it
Right.
home.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
when last we met, the Mishnah taught us that two graveyards were established for the burial of those executed by the court. So not only do you have the communal graveyard, which the convicted, executed criminals are not allowed to be buried in, but even in the criminal graveyard run by the town, there is a separation based on how you were executed, which is meant to be linked to the severity or the nature of bad associated with the crime that you did for which you were executed. I mean, in my mind, dead is dead. But I guess if I have the choice between an injection in my sleep or being drawn and quartered live, there are differences as far as the experience of the person being executed. And that's meant to be linked to the severity of their crime. And remember, they're pushing a theology here that your execution is an effective atonement for your sin, which of course means that by having a court of law and an execution, you may be granting that person a place in the world to come. Otherwise, what good is atonement? Okay, Ula said that Rabbi Yochanan said that if you unwittingly ate the forbidden fat and separate, I'm at the bottom of 47a, just getting a running start. Nope, that's not where I want to be. Okay, 47a at the very end, we have an argument, Rav and Abaye, right?
Right.
About the atonement, and we were talking through a couple of verses to try and figure out whether or not wickedness and atonement works or not. So Rava said, are you comparing one who was killed in the state of wickedness to one who died in the state of wickedness? An unrepentant sinner who died in the state of wickedness does not achieve atonement, since he died a natural death, and there was nothing to bring about atonement. But a transgressor who is killed in his state of wickedness achieves atonement, even without repentance, since he did not die a natural death, but rather he was executed. So, if you have in modern times, according to Rava, an argument about death penalty, right? There are those who are opposed to death penalty on humane grounds, who just, as a matter of philosophical belief, think that killing somebody is never justified if what that person did wrong was killing somebody. In other words, killing somebody because killing is wrong doesn't make any sense. So there are people opposed to death penalty on that philosophical, moral ground. Likewise, there are people who would say that killing somebody who did something to somebody that wasn't killing somebody should not happen because it's not equal. And the argument against that is sometimes what you do to the living who survive is worse than killing them. Surely that person should be executed, that kind of stuff. So, we're not solving those moral, ethical debates. They go back as old as Plato and beyond. They're thousands of years old. In Judaism, there's death penalty in the Torah. It is a firm and a permanent belief in the history of Judaism that execution is at least sometimes legitimate. So the execution of Adolf Eichmann was legitimate. And that's pretty universal. You've got some people who are still, no, I don't like death penalty. And then you get people who can you be sure you have the right people? Wrong people have been executed before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all kind of ways to get at the death penalty because you already don't like it, right? And those things just kind of follow whatever the technology of the day is. In this case, you would actually have for the person who has kind of a softer heart, who has more compassion, you have an argument why you would want the court.
Rabbi, your voice is dropping out.
I haven't done anything to change.
It's back.
All right, fair enough. What I'm saying is that from the point of view of compassion, according to Rava, you have this argument that you might, as a compassionate person, you might want to execute somebody because they get the benefit of atonement. And I would argue, theoretically, if they were alive, would you not want them to have the benefit of Yom Kippur? Right? So if you have somebody who's done something horrible, and they really accept that it's horrible, they recognize it, they're sorry beyond compare. Hang on, I got someone dialing in here. Yes, Francesca. That is my understanding. Ron, what password did you use to get in?
B'nai 613, capital B, no hyphen.
Okay. All right. Hope you make it. If they were alive and repentant, you would want them to have Yom Kippur. Everyone? Yes? If you're a compassionate person, look, if you're not compassionate towards the person, you're happy killing them. If you're not happy killing them because you're a compassionate person, don't you want to go farther and also...
In other words, the person who's going to be executed wants to atone, so you're saying...
Yes, the guilty party accepts their guilt. And beyond reasonable hope, they are told in the Torah that atonement exists. And that if they go through a process of tshuva, they are able to gain atonement from God. Right? And if you're a compassionate person, and that's why you don't want death penalty, then you're probably a compassionate person who wants the guilty party to do tshuva and have access to atonement. Right? A compassionate person would want people to have access to atonement. Otherwise, you're like, there might be some people who are like, I don't want to execute him because I want him to rot forever in the filthiest jail we can ever provide and make him suffer like they suffered for the rest of his days. I'm not talking about that person. Right? The person from Rachmanis is saying we shouldn't kill people for killing, and you would say they probably also think the person should access to atonement. So, for example, what's the purpose of a prison system? Right? The main purpose of a prison system is twofold: to protect society, and, quite frankly, to avoid recidivism, to allow people to turn about their ways and gain training and counseling and skills so that they can come out in society and not be a criminal. Our criminal justice system is really bad at both of those goals, right? It's just not, it's really hard to achieve those goals in a prison population. But that's what we hope for. So the other argument against death penalty is they have time in prison. Like, why do you give someone 25 years in prison? I think it might take you at least 15 or 20 years to really figure out how bad it is and why it's not just not in your interest to have done it, but it's not in other people's interest and you care about other people, that kind of thing. Like, long prison terms are punitive, but they're also meant to be corrective. That's why it's called the correctional system, right? The Essex County Department of Corrections, right? It's meant to be correctional. Whether it is or not is the other argument, okay? So there's a lot of reasons from Rachmanis about how you would deal with somebody who has done something terribly wrong. And if they're going to be executed, there's actually a rabbinic view here that there's a benefit for that, right? So it's very interesting. It's not how most people think about these things today. Now, know therefore that it is written, and we get this little Midrash Agadah kind of thing, where you get a psalm. Oh God, nations are coming to your heritage. They defiled your holy temple and laid Jerusalem in heaps, and the dead bodies of your servants that have given to food the birds of the sky and flesh your pious ones to the beasts of the earth. What is the meaning of your servants, and what is the meaning of your pious ones? Is it not, in other words, it is, that your pious ones refers literally, your pious ones refers to those who fear God, and your servants are those who had initially been liable to receive punishment, but once they were killed, they are called your servants. In other words, it's a rhetorical question meant to prove that even bad people can become your servants. Pious ones are pious ones, and servants are the non-pious ones who become pious ones. Abaye says to Rabbi, now we're on Sanhedrin 47b. Everyone there?
It's on.
Rock and roll. Those referred to in the verse in Psalms who were killed by the heathen government, to those inhabitants of an idolatrous city who were killed by the Jewish court. So now maybe tzadikim and avdecha is people executed by the heathen government or those executed by the Jewish court. Those who were killed by the heathen government, since they were killed unjustly, achieve atonement through their deaths, even without repentance. But those who were killed by a Jewish court, since they were killed justly for their sins, do not achieve atonement unless they repent. So it's adding this concept of repentance. Remember, in the Mishnah, they had this whole rigmarole that you went through, giving the person the opportunity to repent before execution. So we already know we're going to wind up in that place, because the Mishnah said clearly that you want to give the person the opportunity to repent. That must be for a good reason. The heathen court doesn't give you that opportunity, and it doesn't give a damn if you do or don't repent. It's just going to kill you. So the rabbis are saying if you're executed by a heathen court, presumably you are by definition killed unjustly. Therefore, you have by definition suffered in your dying, and therefore you are automatically granted atonement as having paid a price for the sin that you may have committed in life, even if it's not why they killed you.
I'll leave it alone. Why, by definition, just because it's a separate court?
So
Why is it automatically unjust?
under Rome, people were being killed. And local law was still under the authority of the rabbinic system and the Sanhedrin. So anyone who Rome killed because Rome wanted to kill them. Rome wasn't killing them because they had done anything wrong. Rome wanted to kill them because Rome killed people. That's how they controlled the land. So the rabbis are viewing that as automatically presumed to be just death squads of Roman legionnaires or even Roman courts killing people in the land just to abuse them into submission under the Roman Empire. That's the assumption. So you can't draw an analogy there to the Essex County Courthouse, right? Or to whatever court it is in New Jersey that theoretically could dole out a death penalty. We don't have death penalty, right?
Not anymore.
Not anymore. We had, but now we don't. So the secular courts with death penalty in this country is more of a process of justice and does allow for the possibility of tshuva. Not only that, the Supreme Court has ruled that clergy must be afforded to anybody on death row, right? So the person has the opportunity to receive a rabbi for counseling and for repentance or whatever they want to do with the rabbi prior to execution. So I would argue that actually Our secular courts would not fall into this category. It would seem to me it does not, because of the access to rabbinic counsel before execution. Okay? Nevertheless, the Gemara adds, know that this is true as we have learned in the Mishnah. So I'm going to move the text on the screen up for the viewing audience at home. Know that this is true as we have learned in the Mishnah. They would not bury the executed transgressor in his ancestral burial plot, and if it enters your mind to say that once the transgressors are executed by the court, they achieve atonement, then let them be buried in their ancestral burial plots. The Gemara rejects this argument. An executed transgressor cannot be buried in an ancestral burial plot because in order to achieve atonement, both death and burial are needed. So it's a really good halachic argument. They say, oh yeah? Oh yeah? So if you get executed by the court, the Jewish court, and you did repentance properly, and you're tip-top, crystal clear, all is forgiven, you have atonement, you're in the world to come, then why doesn't that body get buried in the ancestral plot? By the time they're dead, they're fine, right? And the argument is no. Mostly just because no. But the way they say that is they say that execution and burial are connected mitzvot. So the execution, remember, kavor yikbarenu. Remember, we had this, you can't leave him on the pole or on the tree, because the execution and the hanging and the burial, they're all connected. They're all part of one system of commandments that can't get separated from each other. So since at the time that command came to bear on him, it was part of the execution, he hadn't atoned yet, and therefore he's buried like a criminal, not buried like someone who has gained atonement. Okay? Once he has been buried in the graveyard set aside for the wicked, he then achieves his full atonement. 48a. And the crowd is storming the front table to get the next page. I have one person. Everyone say hi to Bonnie Smiler. Wave. Bonnie. They can pretend to see you. Okay. So, here we are. Was that the end of... That wasn't the end of 47b.
Oh, it's the beginning.
Yeah, 47b. Give me that back.
Well, I can keep this for the next.
Okay, that's fine. All right, 47b. Those referred to in the verse in Psalms who were killed by the heathen government, etc., etc. Rav Ada, okay? Everyone see Rav Ada? Rav Ada bar Ahava raised an objection to this from another ruling in the Mishnah. The relatives of the executed transgressor would not mourn him with the observance of the usual mourning rites, but they would grieve over his passing, since grief is felt only in the heart. And if it enters your mind to say that once the executed transgressors are buried, they achieve atonement, let the relatives of the executed transgressor mourn him as well, as he's already achieved atonement. So this is taking the same logic and saying, like, at what point is this guy forgiven? If he was forgiven at execution, then let his burial be proper. No, execution and burial are a combined mitzvah. Fine. Once he's buried, let the family sit shiva for him like a regular guy. No. Right? And what's the answer for no? The Gemara refutes this argument. An executed transgressor is not mourned because in order to achieve atonement, decomposition of his flesh is also needed. Once his flesh has decayed, he has received full atonement. The Gemara notes that the language of the Mishnah is also precise, as it teaches. Once the flesh of the deceased has decomposed, they would gather his bones and bury him in their proper place in his ancestral burial plot, indicating that with the decomposition of his flesh, the executed transgressor achieves atonement so that he may be buried alongside his righteous relatives. The Gemara affirms, learn from the Mishnah, and this is so. So there's a problem here, because in modern times, a family who is told you can't bury him in the family plot might actually choose to cremate. Now what do you do? there is no flesh to decompose. And yet the death and burial was the trigger for atonement. So now, ironically, if the person were executed and buried in the criminal's well, he would have to be buried in the criminal graveyard. So I guess to cremate, you would have to then exhume the body and cremate him. And they certainly wouldn't want to do that. So that's not going to be allowed. So, okay, we don't have a problem. I was talking myself into it, but you see where I was going, though, right, Ron?
Yeah, I mean, in those days there was a two-step process in
Yes.
burial. We
Yes.
no longer have a two-step process. Once you've been planted, that's it.
Right. So in this case, that you're in the ground, but you're not going to mourn until time has gone by enough to allow the body to desiccate. So you got to give it a year or so. Now, I've never exhumed a body. I understand that there's quite some period of time that recognizable remains of the body in an undisturbed grave are there. But it might just really be the bones and hair and stuff like that. So this is kind of morbid by definition. So let's move on.
Just to sort of say, I think nowadays we have I was thinking of a two-step process, which is when we dedicate the headstone about a year later. So we first bury the person, and then we come back 1 year later, according to Ashkenazis, not Sephardi, and then have a dedication ceremony. Maybe that's the same concept of what.
I don't know if it's the same concept. It could be similar as far as timing, and it could achieve the same goal spiritually or emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you would execute the person, bury them, not sit Shiva. The family has to do their proclamation to the court that they recognize the court's justice and they don't hold them guilty for the death of their loved one.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it comes time for a matzeva, for a monument, maybe you can actually inscribe a stone that says something other than this wicked Rasha who murdered somebody. You could say, beloved father, grandfather, husband, brother, etc. Maybe.
Cool.
The Gemara refuted that, however, and went to the Mishnah. So, okay, fine. Now, why does this move so quickly? Okay, Rav Ashi says, an alternative resolution to the objection raised by Rav Ada Barachafa may be suggested. When does the obligation of mourning a deceased relative commence? It begins from the time of the sealing of the grave with the grave cover. And when is atonement achieved? Atonement is achieved when the deceased begins to see and experience a bit of the anguish of the grave. Consequently, since the mourning rites were set aside at the time that they should have begun, they remain permanently set aside even after the executed transgressor has in fact achieved atonement. So what does this mean? Anyone want to take a stab at it? Yes. So the rabbis have a theological belief of death, that the dead person is really only physically dead, right? And that the dead person has ongoing awareness, even perhaps ongoing presence, for some undetermined period of time, and can somehow sense, therefore, the manner of their death or the manner of their burial, and experience a bit of the anguish of the grave. Or you could interpret that as, going up to their execution, they were scared of death, right? But it doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be like they're aware of where you're burying them. Consequently, since the mourning rites were set aside at that time, they remain permanently set aside even after the executed transgressor has in fact achieved atonement. So when does he get atonement? Basically, when you seal the grave, when he's in, you've already done everything you do. You put him in the ground, and the family doesn't do shiva, and he's already gained atonement.
When does the neshama go, or the soul leave? Does the soul leave? I mean,
the Talmud doesn't talk about neshama that way. That's really a later development in Judaism as far as a well-defined concept of neshama. The 8th, 9th, 10th century, we start to really see that as far as the writings of Saadia Gaon, really first under the influence of Islam and the philosophy of the Islamic Aristotelians who believe that there's a permanent soul that's the image of God that survives always, that kind of thing. It's not clear. The Talmud is much messier than that. The Talmud is much earthier than that. The Gemara asks, if so, that the executed transgressor gets atonement as soon as he experiences a bit of the anguish of burial, why do I need decomposition of the flesh to occur before he can be reburied in the ancestral plot? Right? It's the same argument. If the second you shoveled in the grave, he's atoned for, why can't I then move him to the plot? And remember, it was cleaner back then because the first stage happened in a cave on a shelf, and you could go and you could just gather those remains without doing any digging by going back into the cave and taking the remains off the shelf, putting them in a box, and taking the box to the family plot. So why can't you you sit Shiva? It doesn't make sense in that case. He's experienced the anguish of the grave. Now he's atoned for. Why can't we sit Shiva? Gemara says because it's impossible to move a partly decomposed body in a respectful manner, and therefore they wait until the body is fully decomposed. And that's my exhuming case, where I said you bury the guy in the ground. Why can't you just unbury him and move him to the family plot? And the answer is it's not kavod hamet. It's not respectful. A dead body, you're going to do damage to it. It's going to fall apart or something as you go along, and that's not nice. It's icky. You're not supposed to do that. It doesn't answer, by the way, why the person can't be sat Shiva for, just because you can't move the body. But it does answer why you can't move him to the plot. Now, it was related that people would take dirt from the grave of Rav as a cure for a one-day fever. So here you go. This is going to be your COVID
cure.
Yeah, this is going to cure you of COVID. You take a little bit of the dirt from the grave of Rav, and you mix it in your coffee, and you could be cured of a one-day fever. Please, nobody take me seriously when I say that. A number of people came and told Shmuel, by the way, Rav's arch adversary, about this practice, thinking that perhaps the dirt should be forbidden, as one may not derive benefit from a corpse. Shmuel said to them, they are acting properly, as the dirt in the grave is natural ground, and natural ground does not become forbidden in any circumstance. Okay, so natural ground and does not become forbidden in any situation, as it is written, and he brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord and beat it to dust, and cast the dust of it upon the graves of the common people. This verse juxtaposes the graves of the common people to objects of idol worship. This teaches that just as objects of idol worship are not forbidden when attached to the ground, the Gemara interjects by teaching the source of this halacha, as it is written, you shall utterly destroy all the places in which the nations whom you are to dispossess served upon their gods, upon the high mountains, upon the hills, upon every leafy tree, and you shall overthrow the altars, break the pillars, and burn the Asherim with fire, end quote. There is an obligation from that verse to destroy their gods that are upon the mountains, but there's no obligation to destroy the mountains that are themselves their gods, meaning that if people worship the mountain itself as a god, there's no need to destroy the mountain, as anything that is attached to the ground does not become forbidden. The Gemara resumes the comparison. Back to our topic. Here too, with regard to the prohibition against deriving benefit from a corpse, the dirt in the grave is attached to the ground, does not become forbidden. In other words, Shmuel said, yes, you could take the dirt from Rob's grave because the dirt of a grave is not forbidden from use. It might become impure still, but it's not forbidden. It's not a sore. Okay.
Although if enough people take dirt, that would kind of...
They would be unburying the guy, right? They'd be exhuming him if everyone went and took dirt. The Gemara raises an objection against this ruling from a Baraita. If one hews a grave for his deceased father in one place and then goes and buries him in a different place, the son may never be buried in the grave that he dug, as it is prohibited to derive benefit from a grave that had been prepared for another person. We have this every once in a while, by the way, where you get to the cemetery and they open the wrong hole. We get there. We've seen this before. Usually, 99% of the time, the family is wrong. But I would say there's been at least 5 different times in my rabbinate when I got to the cemetery with the hearse and the coffin and we went over to the grave, family members said, stop. It's not the right grave. Either we know we purchased plots over there by the tree, or we know that it was lined up, grandmother, grandfather, father, mother, and you're going grandmother, grandfather, mother, father. And that's not how we wanted it, right? That kind of thing. Usually they're wrong because they don't realize that when you dig a grave, you come and you get the backhoe and you move all the other stones around the grave. You lift them and move them. So they're like, I've come here visiting my father's grave every Rosh Hashanah for the last 20 years, and I know I stand here next to the Shlomovich or the Schwartz or the Cohen family, and 2 graves over is Dad. And here we are, 4 graves over. Well, the stones have moved by the backhoe to make room for the equipment to dig the hole. That's what's usually going on. However, hang on, if you in fact did get it wrong, and you dug a grave for a person, the argument could be made according to this moment in the Talmud that no other person could ever be buried into that grave. You're not allowed to derive benefit from a grave that had been dug for a different person. So even if you exhume Dad and put him in a different plot, you cannot then use the grave that you took Dad out of. Question?
Well, I was commenting when you were giving the example that case of my in-laws, there was one big stone and then 4 small pieces. My in-laws and my sister-in-law are buried there. There's an empty spot we didn't use for my husband, but we were told that where the carvings are for who was underneath, it doesn't quite match.
Yeah, it's approximate. Because 4 graves are larger than the family stone with 4 names on it. So the graves actually go farther out than that big stone. So the coffins underground are not lined up with the names on the stone. If you have a headstone, the small stone that's separate from the big family stone for each individual person, that's actually supposed to be right where that person is buried. So the small markers are supposed to be exact, but the large family ones are not exact. Okay, this indicates that even that which is attached to the ground can become an item from which deriving benefit is prohibited. Right, that's the you can't use it. Okay, the Gemara says, well, what are we dealing with here? You just brought an interesting case of not being able to reuse a grave, but that has nothing to do with the dirt from Rav. We are dealing not with a grave dug in the ground, but with a cave that was constructed above ground out of rocks that were hewn from the ground. In such a case, all the stones used in the construction became forbidden as they were detached from the ground. But that makes no sense, of course, because we're talking about Rav where they were taking dirt from the grave. It doesn't make sense. But they're just bringing up another point. They wanted to tell you that if you build an above ground cave out of rocks from below the ground, then that seems to be understood as burial in the ground, which is very interesting for the mausoleum industry, right? The mausoleums that we build in this area, I don't build mausoleums and I don't use them, but the mausoleums that I have seen built, they start with metal I-beams. They basically create a grid of metal beams, and then they put in rebar, and they pour concrete, and they create all the rectangular boxes in the wall by building that way. That's not using stone. Theoretically, by this passage, you could create a mausoleum entirely out of hewn stones that would be kosher for quote-unquote above-ground burial. Nobody has looked into this because nobody wants to look into this, right? Besides, the stone would be so much more expensive. The cemetery companies that are for-profit organizations would not want to do it unless there was a massive market of Jews willing to go into them, which any Jew willing to go into that is probably willing to go into the one they build in the modern manner. Fair enough? Okay. Come in here, Tashma. We have a Tashma. Come in here, a different proof from that which was taught in a Baraita. With regard to a fresh grave that was not designated for anyone in particular, we just dig holes so that we have them ready to go. One is permitted to derive benefit from it. But even if a non-viable newborn that died was cast into it, one is prohibited from deriving benefit from the grave. Okay, so this is a delicate category, and I certainly hope and pray that it's not touching anyone individually. If it is, I apologize. It's in the Talmud. In our days in the conservative movement, we allow Shiva and posthumous naming for children that were born that did not live a full month. In Talmudic times, when a third or more of babies born died, having a live birth did not mean you were going to have a child who survived. They did not mourn that child fully with Shiva and everything else unless the kid lived 30 days. So even in the lifetime of the older members of this congregation, you may have known an experience where there was a baby that died that was not buried in the Jewish cemetery. I disagree with that practice vociferously. I think the baby should be buried in the Jewish cemetery. What you will often see in the older cemeteries is over there by the wall of the cemetery, removed from the other graves, you'll see a lot of small markers. And what that is that's the baby burial ground. And it's a terribly sad place to visit. But if you are ever in a Jewish cemetery that's older and you look along the walls and you see an area with a lot of little stones, it's worth going by and saying a prayer. It's a very emotional place to be. And, you know, there's also a market thing. If you have a baby, God forbid, who has passed away, who's the size of your hand, the truth of the matter is, and I know it sounds crass, but big adult-sized graves are expensive. And the concept of taking the 6-foot long grave, actually 8-foot long grave and 6-foot, you know, and using physically that amount of space for a burial that you really only need the size of your laptop, you know, is that worth doing that? Should we do that? Should we deny it? Like in our congregation where there's only a couple of dozen graves left at King Solomon, right? Not everybody in our congregation is going to get to be buried in our synagogue cemetery. And we've been advertising this, so I don't think people like to think about it. They haven't really realized it. Those graves are going to sell out. Should we keep one of those away from an adult, you know, if there was, you know, that. The other thing is the conservative movement has also allowed burial and posthumous naming for those who wish, not required, in the case of a stillborn, right? So if you have a stillborn, which is one of the saddest things, and we have not been good at supporting people emotionally in such a loss. The tradition has basically ignored that human circumstance. And the conservative movement has tried to afford some type of reflective mourning or day of sorrow or day of support associated with that. It's such a private time. These rituals are well-meaning, but I don't know anybody who's actually embraced it. You know, I've someone who has had a stillbirth and said, I want to have a day of mourning and have the community come into my home. You know, it's hard. It's really hard. In the Talmud, back to our topic at hand, let's kind of put that aside and just understand that they said if a child didn't live 30 days, there's no formal burial, there's no formal shiva, there's no nothing, no name, because you wouldn't want the name attached to somebody who had died, since you're naming usually as an honor for people who had lived. Why would you honor a living person with the name of a child who had had this horrible fate? So the Gemara here too, the reference to the grave that was constructed above ground out of risk. So anyway, backing up, even if that, let's say you were digging graves just to have them open and ready, they haven't been dedicated, and so theoretically you can still derive benefit from them, but somebody has now buried a child who lived for 5 minutes in the grave. Halachically for the Talmud, that's not a burial. Therefore, the grave, you might argue, has not been used. Therefore, you might argue the grave is still viable to derive benefit from, but this Baruch says no. Right? Even if a non-viable newborn that was died was cast into it, one is prohibited from deriving benefit from the grave. Okay?
Yes, it might be, I don't know if it applies or not. What about graves where vertically, where more than one person is
Stacking people. Yeah, what about graves where there's 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 on top of each other, which you may have seen in Eastern Europe, in some of the old Jewish cemeteries there on tour? Look, if you have to do it, you have to do it. As long as you're not digging through, God forbid, a body, if you have to go in layers, you can do that. The truth is, eventually, you can rotate the soil too. After a couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years, you know, maybe you go back to the older part of the cemetery, you just dig down, you're not going to find anything. All right, and you could do new burials. If you only have so much land, you only have so much land. What can you do? They would rather you reuse older areas of the cemetery then adopt cremation. That would be the decision. Burial in the ground is too important. All right, another tashma. Come in here. A proof from another baraita. It turns out that you say that there are 3 types of graves, and each type is governed by a different halacha with regard to whether or not a corpse may be removed from the grave and buried elsewhere. There's a newly found grave, a known grave, and a grave that causes damage to the public. Okay? Tahor. Okay, and what's the law? How so? With regard to a new grave, a grave in which a corpse had been buried without the permission of the property's owner, one is permitted to move the corpse from the grave and bury it elsewhere. Right? After he has removed the corpse, the place of the grave is ritually pure, and he's permitted to derive benefit from it. So the new grave in this case is you go to bury Dad, and you get there, and there's a freshly dug and filled John Doe in Dad's plot. You can exhume John Doe, bury him elsewhere, and put Dad in the plot he's supposed to be in. Okay? What's the problem with that from what we've learned so far? Well, we had this case that if you dug a hole for somebody, you can never use that for somebody else. So in this case, the hole could not have been dug for somebody because the owner of the plot didn't give permission for it. So that dedication of the land for that person never happened. Okay? All right. Next, the second case is the kever hayadua, the known grave. Okay? With regard to a known grave, a grave in which a corpse has been buried with the permission of the property's owner, it's prohibited to remove the corpse from the grave and bury it elsewhere. If you went ahead and removed the corpse, the place of the grave is ritually impure, and it is prohibited to derive benefit from it. So you can exhume a body, but if they were supposed to be there, you can never reuse that grave. And that's exactly parallel to the story we had a couple of paragraphs ago. Right? Now, a grave that causes damage to the public. This is an interesting and a modern case. A grave was dug on a public road and causes passerbys to contact ritual impurity. One is permitted to remove the corpse from the grave and bury it elsewhere. After he has removed the corpse, the place is ritually pure, but nevertheless it is prohibited to derive benefit from it. Indicates that even that which is attached to the ground can become forbidden, even after the corpse has been removed from the grave. The Gemara answers here too, the reference is to a grave that was constructed above ground. All right, so the damage to the public is a Kohen cannot pass over a grave because it renders him impure, and then he's not able to do what he's supposed to do. Similarly, other people don't want to become impure even for a day because it might keep them from being able to do their business or engage in their marital relations and all kinds of other things. So if for some reason somebody buried, under the Meadowlands Stadium, let's say. Somebody got buried under the Meadowlands Stadium.
A possibility.
We call it the Hoffa rule. You can move that body if you find it because it's rendering the entire stadium impure, which could explain a lot of the quality of play that happens in that stadium. Not entirely sure. But in any event, I would have said that the more likely modern example is sometimes, and I know this is going to be gross and icky, but especially non-Jewish cemeteries, where there are chemicals that have been put into the bodies before burial, cemeteries can leach into the groundwater. And that's kind of gross, right? So if you have cemetery leaching into the groundwater or into the well water, it can be poisoning the town. Can a town that has a cemetery leaching into its groundwater exhume the dead and relocate them somewhere else? According to this, the answer to that would be absolutely yes. Okay? Somebody once told me that the leaching of desiccation could be unhealthy anyways, even without the chemicals. If you have a large number of desiccating bodies at the same time, it could change the chemical nature and the pH of the ground and all kinds of things like that. I think that's a little excessive unless you've buried after a natural disaster or something like that. But if there is danger to public health, you can move bodies. But the remaining land that you took them from is still not to be used for private benefit after that point.
I was thinking of various movies in there where there's a cemetery or their body's buried for whatever reason, and then the land gets sold to the developer.
Right. The common modern case is an unknown graveyard is discovered in the process of land development, right? And the developer has to relocate the graves. Pretty much that's just filing paperwork and getting the job done. It's an additional cost. Sometimes in New York, you'll find paupers' graves, or there was a case of African-American graveyard a couple of years ago that has historic value because of the nature of its discovery and the time in which those burials probably happened and the historical circumstance. Then it's interesting because the government comes in with eminent domain and claims a social, societal value to that land, right? And what will we do with those burial plots? Although I've seen eminent domain used to help a developer put up a mall too. So, it's whenever the government thinks most people need it this way, they'll call eminent domain. We're very hesitant to move bodies, and if we do, we don't like people to benefit from the land that has been freed of the bodies. So whereas eminent domain to allow a developer would be secular law, this case is clear. Eminent domain to turn a profit on the land is not permitted. Eminent domain to allow the land to be crossed over freely by people without deriving other benefit would be allowed. So I guess the question would be, are there tolls or not on the highway? If you had to put a highway through a land where you had to remove graves. If there were tolls on that highway, it's probably not permitted. If there are no tolls on the highway, you could argue it is permitted. Don't know.
Or if there's tolls, but it only goes to maintain the highway.
If it's not turning a personal profit, do you allow the government to profit? Therefore, the tolls are governmental and they're only a tax? Maybe. Yeah, I like the way you're thinking. I don't like the topic as a whole. But, it's not what I woke up in the morning to say, hey, let's go talk about exhuming dead bodies and charging taxes on the ground. But, this is where the Talmud is. And again, the reason this is in the Talmud is at some point this must have happened. This isn't one of those crazy things where the rabbis are saying, if then, if then, if then, if then, if then. These are really grounded. Tashma, there's a Baraita. There's a teaching about this case. Tashma, another Baraita, a teaching about this case. Those tend to be much more practical, right? Hava Amina, I would have thought that's all made up thinking. But Tashma is usually a case that existed somewhere.
The other thing I'm thinking, but I don't think it applies here, is you have war or battle, and what are you going to do with all the dead bodies? Bury them?
Right. This is why I said the number of bodies, some disaster. War would be the same case. I mean, the beaches of Normandy were suddenly full of makeshift burials, right? So what do you do with that land, that kind of thing? Okay. Having cited in this last Baraita that the Gemara raises a question about one of its details, a newly found grave, is one really permitted to remove the corpse just because it was buried there without the owner's permission? Perhaps this is a corpse with no one to bury it. Okay, so here's Normandy. This is where by accident you died. They didn't stop and ask the farmer who owned the fields above the beach if they could please bury the 10,000 dead soldiers on his land. They simply buried the soldiers. They had to, right? So, maybe these are people who didn't have someone else to care for them, and therefore the burial was a mitzvah. So if the burial was commanded, then the owner's permission is irrelevant, because the owner is therefore commanded for the burial to take place on that land. It's a met mitzvah. If the deceased has no relatives or acquaintances to bury him, everyone is obligated to assist in the burial. And the halacha is that a met mitzvah acquires its place. You don't have to ask permission before burying a met mitzvah. The corpse is buried where it was found, and one is not permitted to move it. The Gemara says a met mitzvah is different as it generates publicity. Everyone hears all about it. Where the corpse buried in a newly found grave, that of a met mitzvah, people would have heard about it. So we're really not talking about a notorious case of a found body on the outskirts of town. Everyone would have heard about that. It would have been in the news, all the gossip. It would have been the talk at the Kiddush, right? As opposed to just somebody got buried in someone else's grave. It's just a different topic. Not as well known, therefore it doesn't have the halachic effect. Itmar. It was stated that the Amorim disagreed about the halacha in the following case. With regard to one who weaves a garment for one who has died, what is the halacha? Abaye says it is prohibited to derive benefit from the garment even if it was never actually used as a shroud. And Rabbah says it is permitted to derive benefit from the garment. Okay, so I have tachrichim, I have this white shroud to wrap for a burial. And I ordered it, and I didn't use it. Can I use it as a tablecloth? It's just this big white shroud. Why not? Right? Rava says it's permitted. Can I sell it to another family? Right? Okay. The Gemara explains the respective opinions. Abaye says that one is prohibited from deriving benefit from the garment, since he maintains the mere designation of an item is the significant matter. All the relevant halacha of an item already apply once the item is designated for a specific purpose, whether or not it has been used for that purpose. Therefore, a garment woven for one who had died is forbidden as if it had already been used as a shroud. And Rava says the garment is permitted as he maintains that merely designating is nothing, and therefore the garment becomes prohibited only when it is actually used as a shroud. Okay? So Rava and Abaye have a long-running argument on this topic through every topic of halacha in every tractate of Talmud. Right? Anywhere like in the temple or in inheritance law where you say, I hereby declare not that this phone is for Ron Goldberg. Right? Abaye says, I can now not give it to Bonnie. It's Ron's phone, even though I haven't given it to him, even though I never give it to him. I can never give it to anyone else. Rava says, if Ron doesn't have it in his hands, I can turn around and give it to anybody I want. Till I've actually used it for that purpose, it's still mine to deal with as I please. And obviously that becomes very important in sacrificial law when you dedicate a particular goat for sacrifice, or you dedicate an animal to be your Korban Pesach, and then you don't use it for the Korban Pesach. Can you ever use it again for another purpose? Abaye will say no, Rava will say yes. Got it? Got it. Gemara explains the respective opinions. Rava says that one is prohibited from deriving, okay, we did that. Going down. My Tama. So what's the reasoning behind Abaye? He derives a verbal analogy between the word there, written in the context of the grave, from the word there, written in the context of the heifer whose neck is broken. Of course he does. The verse states concerning a grave, and Miriam died there, and she was buried there. And the verse states concerning the heifer whose neck was broken, and the elders of that city shall bring down the heifer to a hard valley, which is neither plowed nor sown, and shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley. Just as it becomes prohibited to derive the benefit of the heifer whose neck is broken through the mere designation, as soon as the animal is designated as such, here too it becomes prohibited to derive benefit from the items relating to a dead person through mere designation. So he's going to do the comparison of similar grammatical forms. We've seen that before. This halacha used the word there regarding Miriam and burial. This halacha regarding the body that's found on the outskirts of town, and the red heifer is brought, and they swear an oath over it, and they break its neck, and they swear that they are not guilty of the dead, and then they bury the dead. They use the word there as where the heifer's neck is broken. And so there in the case of Miriam meaning burial, and there in the case of the heifer who has been designated for this purpose means that the grave designated for the purpose may not be used by somebody else according to Abaye. Is that a strong argument? You wouldn't have come to that conclusion all by yourself. I think this is one of those things where Abaye already has the opinion, and the Gemara is trying to find a hekesh, a comparison of two similar grammatical forms that allows you to support the Abaye point of view. Okay, I think that's what's going on here. I doubt Abaye did this. I think this was done in support of Abaye later. Okay? And Rava, so Rava's not a dumb guy. What's his point of view and what's it based on? Rava derives a verbal analogy between the word there, written in the context of a grave, from the word there, written in the context of objects of idol worship. So instead of going from the grave to the red heifer, he's going from the grave to idol worship. And the verse states concerning objects of idol worship, the places in which the nation served their gods there, just as it does not become prohibited to derive benefit from the objects of idol worship through mere designation. Sorry, I pushed a button I didn't want to push, and I messed up my screen. Mere designation, but only through the actual ritual worship. So too, here it does not become prohibited to derive benefit from items related to a deceased person through mere designation of the grave. So if I designate an item for idol worship, and I don't use it for idol worship, that item is still of benefit to me according to Rava. And so therefore, since they said there, then in the case of burial where it says there, the same ruling should apply. If I designated it but I didn't use it, the designation doesn't stop me from using it another way. Okay? Okay. We're getting to the last couple minutes of time, and let's just finish the page. The Gemara asks, and Rava, what is the reason that he does not derive a verbal analogy from a heifer whose neck is broken? So, okay, so Rava, you've got a verse, but what are you, Rava, going to do with Abaye's verse? Right? Abaye made a claim that verse teaches this. You haven't refuted the claim. So what do you say about that verse? Rava could have said to you, which is language telling you this is not a Rava argument. This is the editor of the Gemara argument. The editor of the Gemara is asking a question and answering it himself in the name of Rava, that Rava could have said this if I had been there to ask him this question. So that's what's happening in the Talmud right here. He could have said, we derive the halacha concerning the accessories relating to a dead person, a shroud, from the halacha governing the accessories used in idol worship, the animal sacrifice to the idol. This is to the exclusion of a heifer whose neck is broken, which is itself consecrated for the ceremony taking place in the valley and not an accessory used in the ceremony. So Rava could have said, yes, Abaye, you're right. The red heifer says there, the red heifer cannot be benefited from. I get it. But the red heifer is different from a grave and different from a shroud because the shroud is the accessory of the burial. And the red heifer actually has nothing to do with the burial itself. It's a separate mitzvah. So the shroud being connected to the burial is what we really should learn from, not the red heifer that is not essential to the burial of that body. That would have been his answer. We derive the halacha governing the accessories from the halacha according to the accessories and so on. Okay, so that's it. Then we'll stop there.
The heifer is central to the ceremony, consecrated, not accessory.
Correct, and it's
The
not
shroud
part of
is
the
not-
burial.
Shroud is not central to the burial, it's just